Well, good afternoon. First, I want to thank you all for coming today. I'm Steve Ross. I'm the director of the Casden Institute for the Study of the Jewish Role in American Life, and I'm also a professor of history here. And I just want to let you know, if you hear all of a sudden a very loud roar, it means the Rams have scored. There was one a few minutes ago, and I wondered, and then I thought, okay, I know what that is. On behalf of the Casden Institute and USC, I want to welcome you all to the 13th annual Burton B. Lewis Lecture. And this is one of our 3 prominent lecture series that we offer during the year. And it was established in the memory of the alum Burton Lewis. And the Lewis Lectures each year focus on some issue related to the Jewish role in arts and culture, a topic of great interest and close to the heart of the Lewis family. Tonight's discussion, as you all know, is titled "The Impact of Donald Trump's Presidency on American Jewry." And this is likely one of the most relevant questions that faces the American Jewish community as we approach the 2020 presidential elections. And with so many issues at stake in the next year, from the primacy of the place of the State of Israel within American Jewish identity, to the pattern of political discourse that has represented a shift in American sensibility towards issues such as immigration and health care, we as a community have much to discuss and work through before the election. I wish to thank our moderator tonight, Stephen Windmueller, and our panelists, Dr. Saba Soomekh, Donna Bojarsky, Dan Schnur, and Bruce Bialosky, for joining us this evening to discuss the issues facing the Jewish community as we move closer to November 2020. This is one of many events that we offer. We have, as I mentioned, the endowed lectures. We have Sunday events called Casden Conversations. We have started a new initiative called USC Goes to Temple. And yes, why not? Every Jewish Studies Institute in the country invites the community onto campus. We thought it was time for the campus to come into the community. So I would also say, if at the end of this session your temple thinks it would like us to bring speakers into the community, please let me know. We are also proud that every one of our events is free. And as you'll see this evening afterwards, we have a modest drinks. We invite you to drinks and refreshments. I have waited. I'm starting my 5th year as the full director and my 6th year as Casden Institute. I have waited up till now to make any pitch for money, because I really believe you don't ask people for money unless you have the goods that you're selling them. We now have a wide series of programs, and we'd like to expand the USC Goes to Temple. We'd like to expand our Casden Conversations, and we'd like to have enough money to fly people in from throughout the country. I mean, we are very fortunate. In a few weeks, we will have Susan Faludi with us here, and we are trying to get Barry Weiss for next year. But all those things cost money, and this is the only pitch I will make. And so you can help our efforts by texting Casden to 41444. That is Casden, 41444. Before we begin today, it is my great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Peter Mankel, who is the Dean of Humanities at USC and a professor of both history and anthropology. He is also about to leave the country to assume one of the most prestigious positions in the world. He is going to be the Harmsworth Professor of American History at Oxford University this year. Yes, it is a wow. Please enjoy. Please welcome Peter Mankel.
Thank you, Steve. I have to say, Steve is actually the person who ran the search that brought me to USC 18 years ago. So, Steve, publicly, thank you. for that. I'm really delighted to offer a very brief introduction to you on behalf of USC Dornsife, College of Letters, Arts, and Sciences. One of the things that in Dornsife we're very concerned about is making sure that the college, as opposed to professional schools, but the college really has ongoing discussion and dialogue with the larger community here in Los Angeles and frankly beyond, with the world beyond, but especially here in LA. And so a few years ago, when it was time to have a new director of the Casden, it struck me as perfect to bring Steve Ross in. He'd been, as you know, a co-founder of the Los Angeles Institute for the Humanities, deeply engaged with the idea that the university has to have ongoing discussions with the larger community. I mean, it was kind of a bonus for all of us when his brilliant book last year was a finalist for the Pulitzer. But nonetheless, he has brought a commitment to the Casden to do events exactly like the one that we're about to have this evening, to engage in real-world discussions in real time. We live in an age, I'm not making a political statement here, we live in an age in which so many people are just talking past each other and not really talking with each other, that people just who recognize them as different political views just doesn't want to engage them in conversation. One of the things that this event tonight, I think, is going to have is genuine back and forth discussion. Difference of opinion, I suspect we're going to hear, but something that's very important in the era that we're in, which is not only talking, but in fact listening to each other. The panelists are very exciting. I'm going to turn it over to Steve Windmueller in a second to sort of get things going here. But as I say, I'm so delighted that the Lewis Lecture is here on campus tonight, and I look forward to hearing the conversation. So with that, I turn it over to you. Thank you very much. Oh, I turn it over to Steve. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. I do want to add one thing to what Peter said. One of the things that I have been determined to do as director of the Casden is every one of these events, we want to bring light, not heat, onto the most controversial subjects of the day. And so therefore the panel we have organized is a panel of people whose views we respect. We ask you, please, no cheering or booing for anyone. Instead, we are trying to engage in a very serious conversation about, as we say, as Jews, how do we look at what has gone on in the last several years? How do we look at what is going ahead? It is my great pleasure to introduce our moderator for today, Stephen Windmueller, who is the former dean of the Los Angeles campus of Hebrew Union College and the Rabbi Alfred Gottschalk Chair in Jewish Communal Service. Stephen has written more than 100 articles, books, and essays on topics such as anti-Semitism, American Jewish political behavior, Jewish institutional trends, and Jewish power in the Middle East. His works have appeared in the Jewish Journal, Jewish Week, the LA Times, as well as CNN, PBS, and NBC. Just some very quick notes on today's format. Our panelists will talk for roughly 80 minutes. We will then have a Q&A for 20-25 minutes. We do want to get you out. I'm a big believer that if you say you're going to end at 6, you should end at 6. So we will end at 6. In the meantime, during the course of the conversation, there will be people who have pencils and index cards, so that if you have a question, in order to maximize the number of questions we can get, please raise your hand. We will get you an index card, write out your question, and Stephen will compile them and then ask the questions of our panelists. Anyway, we hope you enjoy this afternoon's early evening session. It's my great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Stephen Windmueller.
Thank you, and good afternoon. We are living through a critical moment in the American Jewish story. How we speak with one another, even who's invited to dinner, reflects our political behaviors and passions. Today, we appear to be operating in blue and red cultural frames. The 45th President of the United States, Donald Trump, represents an important component to this new storyline. about how American Jewish political behavior has been transformed. Our task this afternoon is to explore his impact on our community. What does this presidency represent, and how will it be understood in the context of the broader American Jewish experience? And how are we as American Jews responding to this moment? This is not an election event. It is being held at a university, hosted by a research institute. This conversation is about culture, political ideas, and communal values. The panelists represent us, citizens interested in and concerned about the welfare of our democracy and our community. Indeed, we hold deep personal political passions and beliefs in order to more seriously examine the ideas and diversity of ideas that have been generated in connection with this president and this administration. We have formed this conversation. Each of our panelists will make an opening statement, no more than 5 minutes in duration. This will be followed by a series of questions that I will introduce and direct either to specific panelists or to the entire panel. Later in our program, you will be invited, as you've just heard, to submit written questions for the panel to consider. I too wish to thank the University of Southern California, and more directly the Casden Institute, for hosting this event. And a special word of thanks and appreciation to Professor Stephen Ross, the director of the Institute, and to Lisa Ansell, the Casden Institute's assistant director. Let me now introduce the panel members joining us this afternoon, and I will do so in alphabetical order. Allow me for a moment to acknowledge them individually. Each is a prominent professional in his or her respective field of endeavor. All have been very publicly involved in an array of civic causes and Jewish concerns. Bruce Bialosky is a prominent local CPA and realtor. Long active in politics, he founded the Republican Jewish Coalition of California and was appointed by President George W. Bush to the United States Holocaust Commission. He has a weekly column that appears on townhall.com. Donna Bojarsky is a community activist who has worked for President Bill Clinton and Mayor Tom Bradley. She was the founder of the New Leaders Project of the Los Angeles Jewish Federation, co-founder of LA Works, and has served as contributing editor to the LA Magazine. Donna has served on the LA County Human Relations Commission as well. Dan Schnur teaches both here at USC, but also at Cal Berkeley. His columns appear in a variety of newspapers and journals, including the Jewish Journal. Dan is the founder of the USC LA Times statewide political poll. In addition, he has worked over his career on 4 presidential campaigns and 3 gubernatorial elections. Dan is a no-party preference voter, and in connection, he has launched Fixing California, an organization dedicated to campaign finance and political reform. He has an impressive list of accomplishments as a consultant and policy analyst for various research, foundation, and political organizations. Dr. Saba Soomekh is the accomplished academic and research author. Currently, she serves as the Assistant Director of Interfaith and Intercommunity Affairs for the Los Angeles chapter of the American Jewish Committee. Saba has written extensively on the Middle East, religion, and women in developing countries. In addition to her extensive teaching portfolio, Dr. Soomekh serves on the LA Human Resources Commission. Please welcome our panelists. We will begin in the order in which they are seated with Bruce Bialosky for the opening 5-minute presentation.
Thank you for having me here, Steve. I'm just wondering why we are having this forum now and we didn't have it 4 years ago. We had a president who openly cavorted with a group of European countries less interested in the survival of Israel than making a contrived agreement with the single largest funder of terrorism, who supposedly was there then going to suspend their nuclear arms development while completely ignoring their worldwide terrorism network. That president went on to lawlessly act as if that agreement was legal, even though it wasn't, because it was never approved by the United States Congress. Then he did some mumbo-jumbo move with the UN, openly anti-Semitic organization, to give this ridiculous agreement validity in his mind. Then he returned billions of dollars to this terrorist country, whose stated purpose is the destruction of Israel. Originally, it was estimated well north of $100 billion, but now the revisionists are saying it is only $50 billion, as if that was not plenty of money to kill Americans and Jews with. We do know that he flew $1.8 billion in small unmarked bills to be used for the terrorist organizations. Then on his way out the door, this president became the first president to agree with the anti-Semites in the UN to attack Israel, which is the UN's weekly habit and apparently their raison d'etre. Then in the dark of night, he sent $220 million to the Palestinians as he was ending his term that we know would only be used for humanitarian purposes like new tunnels. You want to talk about a president who stopped the $221 billion from being sent? You want to talk about a president who unleashed his administration and his ambassador to attack and defund the UN for their rampant anti-Semitism? You want to talk about a president who took a position established by George W. Bush, which then languished under Bush and Obama, and made the special envoy for monitoring and combating anti-Semitism, and put that position front and center, reporting directly to the Secretary of State and the White House. That envoy, my friend Alon Carr, from this community, is now running around the world meeting with leaders and telling them that if they don't curb anti-Semitism, that the U.S. is going to bite back. You want to talk about a president who rejected the ridiculous agreement with Iran and crippled them financially so they could not feed Hezbollah, Hamas, Boko Haram, and every other group of nutcase murderers. Yet our European horror friends, who are once again selling out the Jews, whine and moan about us pulling back from the agreement that America never approved. Only our lawless president. You want to talk about a president who, after Congress passed a law in 1995 to move the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, his three predecessors disregarded. He actually followed the law and moved the embassy, and now actively recruiting other countries to move their embassies to Jerusalem also. You want to talk about a president that, after 50 years of Israel controlling the Golan Heights, says to Israel, yes, we agree. You would be nuts to give this back to a country that will only use it to launch murderous attacks against Jews. Thus, we agree it is now part of Israel. So my question to you, my dear friend, Dr. Windmueller, aren't you 4 years late on holding this event?
Just for clarification, there was actually an event 4 years ago, and your good friend Larry Greenfield was part of the conversation as we explored the campaign of 2016. Saba, welcome.
Thank you. I would like to thank Dr. Ross, Dr. Windmueller, and the amazing Lisa Ansel for having this important and timely conversation. So you're asking a professor to speak in 5 minutes. Let's see if we could do that. As we all know, there is not a monolithic Jewish community with uniform concerns. The president believes he has a great record on Israel, and many people believe he does have a great record when it comes to Israel. He repeatedly expressed his commitment to Israel and his intention to take a friendlier approach towards Israel and its prime minister. In 2017, as we've discussed, Trump announced the official U.S. recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital, the beginning of the process of moving the U.S. embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. He recognized Israel's sovereignty of the Golan. He has been extremely critical of the Palestinian Authority's pay for slay policy, and in 2018, Trump signed into law the Taylor Force Act, which halted U.S. foreign aid to the Palestinian Authority until the Palestinian terrorists and their families ceased to be paid. The U.S. was UNRWA's, the United Nations Relief Work Agency's, largest single donor. Trump cut aid to UNRWA from $360 million to $60 million in 2018, and then down to zero in 2019. The Trump administration wasted no time sending a message to the United Nations that it would no longer tolerate Israel being singled out for condemnation. Trump withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal with enthusiastic support not only from Israel, but also other Middle Eastern allies such as Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the UAE, and Bahrain. However, not everyone is happy when it comes to Trump and Israel. In 2018, a 2018 survey by the American Jewish Committee found that 57% of U.S. Jews disapproved of Trump's handling of the U.S.-Israel relationship, making support for Israel a wedge issue in American politics. Many American Jews are more concerned about Trump's domestic policies than his Middle Eastern ones. Polling shows that the Israel of today, like it or not, carries less political weight for younger American Jews. Many within the Jewish community disagree with the Trump administration regarding deportation, detention of children, the border wall, tariffs, detention of refugees, treatment of dreamers, and they are highly concerned with the rise of anti-Semitism under this president. The U.S. Jewish community experienced near historic levels of anti-Semitism since 2016. According to the 2019 American Jewish Committee survey of American Jewish opinion, 65% of American Jews think that they are less secure today than a year ago. Is the president an anti-Semite? I don't know. But knowingly or unknowingly, he's peddling in spaces that allow anti-Semites to believe that they have more room to maneuver, and that could be just as dangerous. Trump's relationship with the Jews is both philo-Semitic and anti-Semitic. He has internalized anti-Semitic stereotypes of Jews and appreciates them for these bigoted reasons. He knowingly, or to give him the benefit of the doubt, unknowingly, appropriates anti-Semitic tropes about Jews to politicize anti-Semitism and support for Israel. By talking about issues of loyalty and disloyalty, the president is evoking very dangerous themes and reopening a very dark history where Jews were often accused and killed for supposedly being disloyal to the countries that they lived. Trump is making appeals to Jews and other communities. Jews have traditionally voted Democrat, and Trump knows it. 69% of Jews voted for Obama in 2012, 71% for Hillary in 2016, and a whopping 79% for Democrats in the 2018 midterms. He's trying to paint the Democratic Party as the faces of Congresswomen Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, when in reality, the Democratic Party is a lot bigger than these two women. Trump is not concerned about anti-Semitism. He's concerned about the next elections. But Jews are not a monolithic bloc, nor single-issue voters. He's using scare tactics. If you vote for the Democrats, you're voting for a party that hates Jews, Israel, Zionism. By turning Israel into a partisan matter, he will cause long-term damage to Israel's interests and support in America. We have seen anti-Semitism on the rise, and we need to ask our political leaders, are they contributing to the environment or fighting the danger? We need to de-weaponize and depoliticize anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is on the right and it's on the left. As the scholar Deborah Lipstadt has said, if you see it only on the other side, you are engaged in politics against your opponent and not against the fight against this hatred. With the rise of anti-Semitism and hate crimes, this is far beyond politics and why it deserves this timely conversation and panel. Thank you.
Dan Schnur.
Okay. Thank you, Stephen. And I would, like the other panelists, I want to thank all of you for joining us here today, but also want to offer a special thank you to Lisa and Stephen and the entire team at the Casden Institute. I've had the privilege of teaching at the Annenberg School of Communications here for 15 years now, and the opportunity to teach and lecture in any number of other schools on this campus. And Stephen and Lisa put on the best, the most fair-minded, the most even-handed programming I see in higher education here at USC or otherwise. So please join me in giving them another round of applause and thanks. Not just for bringing us here today, but for reminding us that you can have principled conversations even underneath significant disagreements. So I'm a no-party preference voter. But even before I switched to NPP several years ago, my single biggest pet peeve, my single biggest frustration in higher education, here at SC, or at UCLA, at Berkeley, at Stanford, at Harvard, at Yale, at Cal State Dominguez Hills, my single biggest aggravation in higher education are professors who use their classroom, who mistake their classroom as a bully pulpit from which to inflict, and I choose the verb inflict very purposefully, to inflict their own ideology from the left or the right on their students. I think it shows a fundamental disrespect for our students, and I think it shows a fundamental misunderstanding of what higher education is supposed to be. So I come here today in the same spirit I come into my classrooms, not as an advocate, but as an analyst. And what I tell my students on the first day of every semester is I said, look, if you want to know what I think about these issues, left or right, red or blue, Democrat or Republican, we can talk about them, just not in here. Come to my office hours. Take me for coffee or for lunch. I can be bribed. And then right around midterms, I hand out the grade for food matrix. And if we go to Starbucks, they go from a B to a B+. If we go to Mastro's, they're going to graduate school. It's a very... And so I come today, except for the food offer, in the same spirit. Not necessarily to come here as a defender of the president or an assailant against him, but to offer them some perspective that can augment the really, really smart insights you're going to hear and have been hearing from my fellow panelists. I have nothing but respect for principled partisans like my friend Bruce Bialosky and my friend Donna Bojarsky. They represent everything that's good about American politics. We're supposed to disagree. That's what politics is supposed to be about. But as much admiration as I have for them, I have nothing but disdain. I have nothing but disdain for the nationalists who ooze into racists on the far right, and the anti-Zionists who ooze into anti-Semites on the far left. And I think the biggest challenge we face as a country, as a society, and as a Jewish community is what I explain to my students, something I call selective outrage. When really smart people on both sides of the aisle are willing to justifiably call out the haters on the other side with all the anger and passion they can muster, but are willing to overlook equally inexcusable excesses on their own side of the aisle. And I think ultimately, and Saba spoke to this in her comments, and hopefully we can come back to it, ultimately, if we are going to take the kind of stand in the US and internationally against the alarming growth in anti-Semitism, it's going to require us to acknowledge that there are some things that are more important than partisan divides. And ultimately, if we're going to stand up and push back and fight back against the haters who occupy the extremes of both parties, it's going to require defenders of the Jewish community and of the Jewish homeland who are both pro-choice and pro-life, who both stand for marriage equality and those who have objections to it, both those who call for higher taxes and those who think they ought to be lower. All of those issues are important, but fighting for the survival of our people and of our homeland, I would argue, is an even greater imperative. Now, Donald Trump, as has been said by so many over the last few years, Donald Trump, I would argue, in this case as well, is less a cause and more of a symptom of the polarization that bedevils our country and our community. And as this conversation goes on, we can talk more about him. Those on one side of the aisle, I think, who point with some justification to brave steps he has taken on behalf of the state of Israel that would have been met by widespread praise had they been taken by another president. On the other hand, I think there's equally justifiable criticism of him on a wide range of domestic policy issues that Saba correctly identified have become much more of a driving force for Jewish voters in this country over the last 15 years. So let's talk about Trump tonight. Let's talk about and acknowledge that a majority, not all, but a majority of Jewish Americans would support many but not all of the steps he has taken on Israel and the Middle East. Let's also acknowledge that most, not all, Jewish Americans would stand against him on any number of domestic policy matters that he has prioritized. But when we're through talking about this president, or his predecessor, or his successor, whether that successor comes next year or in 5 years, let's remember that as a community, the only way we're going to survive, the only way we're going to stay strong, the only way we're going to preserve the safety and security of the state of Israel is if we recognize that while we honor legitimate and principled partisans on both sides of the aisle, we have to be willing to put aside those partisan differences on behalf of our community and our future. Thank you very much.
Donna Bojarsky.
So I think I'm going to use my opening. I'll get more analytical later, but I have to say I'm going to speak not as an analyst, but as a partisan and as a Jew. And there are many, some of the major issues that I think really define Trump's relationship with American Jews, I think were brought up by the good doctor, and I think we'll hash them out later on, whether it be the Middle East foreign policy, whether it be the partisan divide, whether it be, making Israel a pawn where it shouldn't be. But what I feel like I want to do is be honest and stand up to things that we know that we have to believe. Donald Trump, to me, is an existential danger to the Jewish people in America and potentially throughout the world. And I think that we have to say that. I don't think we have to say some Jews believe this and some believe that. In fact, what we're talking about is 70 to 80% of the Jews believe one way and a minority believe the other way. That doesn't mean that you don't preserve the right to have dialogue and that people can't disagree. But to sort of whitewash it and say that it's an equal balance, that there's just as many Jewish Republicans as there are Jewish Democrats is nonsense. The numbers have not changed very much at all in Jewish life in America. I had the good fortune to watch, by accident, the Simon Schama History of the Jews. How many people here have seen it? So if you haven't seen it, or if you haven't seen it lately, go home and spend, the weekend watching it. It is, or the next weekend watching it. It's extraordinary. And in 6 episodes, you get a philosophical, theological, historical, passionate telling and retelling of the Jewish story. And if I had many thoughts, as I watched it, but one in particular stood out to me more than any other. Our very being, our very safety has come under threat, most predominantly when the issues of dual loyalty are raised. That's not an inconvenience. That is something absolutely throughout history provable. Empirical evidence that is our biggest Achilles heel. We have been murdered, displaced, thrown out of countries all over the world because of that. The ability that Trump has had to raise that as an issue and for us not to stand up and scream bloody murder completely defies sense to me. When you're attacking wealth and trying to gin up support from, people who are disadvantaged or have had a rough time. Has that ended well? I don't know. Call me crazy. I'm the daughter of a survivor who tells my son when he goes to Santa Monica for school, he has to take a jacket, not because he might get cold, because there might be an incident and I'll be separated from him for 3 days and he'll need a jacket. Okay? So it's not that I don't understand paranoia, but to not stand up when we see something this clear and this dangerous, and that includes the Middle East situation, and that includes, gun safety, and it also includes the fact that the Jewish values are in a different place for most American Jews. Now, you can try to set those things up as equal, but it doesn't work for me. In my opinion, the people who've really benefited from Trump's presidency in the Jewish community are one, Jewish defense agencies, right? I would think it's been a good time for them to be able to, garner support and well deserved. 2, Reform synagogues and day schools. I think that they have benefited from Trump and in my own experience. 3, blue state travel. I know many people, myself included often, are sometimes, afraid to have to, on your vacation, take on these gut-wrenching issues. So that's my introduction. I don't think this is a time like any other. If you rewatch the series, I think you might agree or maybe sharpen your feelings or your fear. I do think we are in a great space in this country, American Jews and others, to really collaborate and come together to really uphold our values and to fight when we see someone so threatening to them. And I look forward to that fight.
I thank each of the panelists for the opening statements, and I wanted to drill down at the outset on domestic issues. We've heard a good deal about anti-Semitism, certainly on Israel, but American Jews have consistently felt that a variety of domestic concerns remain constantly important and basic to their values and principles as voters. Issues including a woman's right of choice, questions related to climate, issues related to immigration, and elements associated with healthcare. I'm wondering which of our panelists would like to sort of delve into those questions from the perspective of Donald Trump's impact and ideas with regard to these issues.
I would like to delve into the premise of the question. The premise of the question is that these issues should be on a par with the two principal issues that the Jewish community should be concerned about, which is Israel and anti-Semitism. I think that's a divide between the people that Donna's talking about and the people who support my opinions. We care about, one, the survival of Israel first, two, any anti-Semitism. As I outlined in my opening statement, this president is dealing with both issues. Whether a child is called a certain pronoun when he's 7 years old is not of the same level of interest. Whether it's climate change is not of the same level of interest. We are interested in the survival of the Jewish people, and the survival of the Jewish people is based on minimizing anti-Semitism around the world and fighting it around the world and fighting it in the United States, and the survival of Israel. Because as I wrote in an article recently, Israel is at the same level of the Jewish people today as the Shema.
Can I just... in fact, the problem with that is, whether you like it or not, those two issues are not the top two issues when you poll American Jews about what's important to them. It is not. Israel has gone between 7, 8, 9 now. And the same anti-Semitism is higher and certainly would be higher now. But the fact of the matter is, the majority of American Jews do not vote single issue based on Israel. They do not vote single issue based on anti-Semitism, except as much as they see that a society that starts closing in is not good for someone who's been a minority and been, persecuted. So that's not, I can cite the study, and I guarantee you Steve can tell you too.
Those polls are very nice, Donna, but I would tell you unequivocally, every Republican Jew, that is their priorities. That's why we're Republican Jews, and we don't support those priorities. And that's the major difference between the people who call themselves Democrats, whether they be leftists or liberals or whatever you want to classify them as Republicans. In unison, I can tell you unequivocally, anti-Semitism in Israel is the issues we are concerned about. That's the survival of Jewish people, and everything else takes second fiddle.
For you.
So a couple of things. One is, other panelists have mentioned, there's no shortage of public opinion polling that shows that the majority of American Jews base their votes on domestic policy issues rather than the safety or security of the state of Israel. The rise of anti-Semitism in this country, I think, provides a tremendous challenge to us, as I was trying to address a minute ago. Donna, I need to apologize. I did not intend to be whitewashing the fact that the Jewish community leans in one direction or the other. I think that's perfectly appropriate. I didn't mean to equalize statistically the number of Jews who vote Democratic and the number of Jews who vote Republican. And so I apologize if that was the impression that I gave. But I guess the point that I would make is that the president is one of the most divisive figures in the history of American politics. And if you are an opponent of his, you find that to be a horrible thing. If you are a supporter of his, you believe that he is standing up for you and the things you believe in. Donald Trump did not create our political landscape. He recognized the opportunity that it presented to him. And it is not him, it's us that created this hyper-polarized, hyper-partisan environment, not just for the Jewish community, but more broadly. I think it is totally appropriate to call out the blood and soil haters on the far right. But I think regardless of who you vote for president, and it's not my job here tonight to tell you who to vote for, but if we're going to scream about the haters on the right, we have to scream just as loud about the BDSers on the left. And calling out the BDSers does not mean that you can't be a good principled Democrat who votes for a Democratic candidate on the range of domestic issues on which Stephen based his question. But I think there is an obligation for us, regardless of whether we have an R or a D or an NPP after our name, to recognize that this hatred is not the sole province of one party or the other. And if we're going to push it back, it's going to require calling out some on our own side of the aisle who might agree with us on domestic issues from the right or the left, but who are standing in our way on something even more important.
I think one of the issues that Dan's bringing up correctly is this political homelessness that a lot of Jews feel in America today, where you're looking at both parties and you're going there, the right is going to the right and the left is going to the left, and where do I sit in the middle of all of this? As a Democrat, do I support if Bernie Sanders is going to be the nominee? And if he is, he has Linda Sarsour on his side, and what does that mean? And as a Jew who believes in Tikkun Olam, and my religion also cares about not only Israel, but immigrants, etc., because that is what my faith is telling me, how can I vote for a president who, in my opinion, and I'm not talking about me personally because I'm here as a centrist, but how do I vote for a president that, in my opinion, is going against everything my faith is telling me regarding Tikkun Olam and taking care of my neighbor, etc.? And I think that this is a big issue that's taking place in the American Jewish community today, is the sense of political homelessness. It's hard to be on the right and it's hard to be on the left. There's a lot of I agree with blah blah blah, but, and it's a tough time to be a Jew in America. It's a tough time to just be an American, I think.
I'm not quite sure that's exactly what the situation is, because I can tell you where we are as Republican Jews. There's a misnomer, there's this perception that Donald Trump has taken over our party. There's a misconception that he's moved it to the right. Republican Jews are liberal on foreign policy, on domestic policy, conservative on defense and economic policies, almost in unison. There's only a difference between the more observant Jews on the issue of abortion, and the ones who aren't as observant tend to be more pro-choice. That's a pretty good definition of Republican Jews. I've had extensive conversations with people across this country regarding what Donald Trump and has had effect upon Jewish Republicans. First of all, let me be clear that Donald Trump was the 17th choice of the 17 candidates for almost every Jewish Republican. He was my 16th choice. Ted Cruz was my 17th choice. The reason we are now very supportive of Donald Trump is not because we've gone to him. He's come to us. His policies, as many people have written, Michael Barone wrote a column. If you're not familiar with Michael Barone, he's only been around longer than God, writing columns on very even-handed. He wrote a column the other day that this guy is just like, he is doing with the Republicans what FDR did with the Democrats back in the 30s. He's doing policies and bringing them along. But I called a friend who was a dedicated Bushy, and a lot of the Bushes were against Trump. I was a Bushy. I was appointed by Bush. And I said to him, where are we now? Where are the Bushes now, considering that Trump just nominated Kavanaugh, who was a Bushy? He said to me, it has nothing to do with Kavanaugh. It's all to do with public policy. We are in line with the public policies that he has followed, he has stated he wants, that he has enacted. And we believe the vast majority of them, now somebody will say to me, oh, what about the tariffs? We'll discuss that separately, which is nobody's favorite policy, the tariffs, but that's a whole different discussion. But for the rest of them, these are mainline Republican policies he's putting through, and he is supporting those policies, and we aren't going to him, he's come to us.
So Donna, I want to raise a question with you. There are issues being raised about the pro-Israel credentials of candidates such as Bernie Sanders. And there are concerns being put forth about the views held by a number of Democrats on the Iran nuclear accord agreement. And there is also some attention, as you well know, being paid to the Squad. So I'm wondering how you might create a defense for why Jews ought to remain in the Democratic Party in light of some of the concerns being proposed or raised by these voices.
Well, first let me say the reason the Jews should be in the Democratic Party is environmental regulations, is education, is government, is civil liberties, is women's rights, is religious pluralism, all the things that, again, American Jews generally speaking, support as their priorities as Jews. So there's a million reasons. I mean, it's not by accident that that so many American Jews are in the Democratic Party. That has been through and consistent all along. So the first reason is because it represents our values, and it represents the values of Jews throughout history. Again, there are people that always said, welcome the stranger, and that to them meant another neighborhood, of Jews. And we, those of us that are, whether you're progressive or just Democratic, see that as something much broader. So I would, and you also have to say that the vast majority of elected officials who are Jewish have also been Democrats. So unless, you think that they're all sort of traitors to their people, I would argue that they have all felt a comfortable home there. So that's number one. Number two, I'm not going to defend Bernie Sanders. I don't want to get into that construct. Are there people serving in Congress who are probably anti-Semitic? 100%. Are there people in our lives that are probably anti-Semitic? Less so in Los Angeles, but absolutely. Are there people that are racist, etc.? Of course there are. And it doesn't mean that you don't call it out. I don't want to give my own opinion, but I do feel that what Ilhan Omar has said is troubling. And it's troubling as an Israel supporter and as a Jew. When I look at Rashida Tlaib, I'm more convinced that her views come from being pro-Palestinian as opposed to being anti-Jewish. So we do have to make our own decisions about that. But, and the Iran nuclear deal, again, the overwhelming percentage of Jewish elected officials and Jews did support the deal. And I will say right now, if I want to pinpoint somebody that I'm proud of as a Jew, it's Wendy Sherman, who is a committed Jew who, if you haven't seen the documentaries about the Iran process of bringing that deal together, look at them. I have never been prouder of anyone than her. That's the kind of person that, to me, as a Jew, speaks to me when you try to use your seichel in order to make policy that ensures the continuation of both Israel and your own people. So I don't want to defend, so I think when times when we need to stand up, if you look at the curriculum that was proposed by for the education community in California, that was a clear thing where I think the Jews were extremely on point to make a statement and to fight against the fact that the Jews were left out of, human history. On the other hand, there are other battles that I've been involved in, we can talk about later tonight, that shouldn't be. So to me, it's the home of our values. It's the home of the values that we have come to accept as American Jews, which has been the most unique sort of experiment in Jewry, in Jewish history. And I wouldn't be anywhere else. What you talk about, there are people that are one-issue voters that are for Israel, and that's their only measure of which they use on a candidate. That's their litmus test. I can't argue with that as their values. I do have to notice that that's not true for most of my countrymen, and certainly for me, would I ever support Jesse Helms? I don't care if if he was going to be there holding the gates open for us instead of sending us to purgatory. I would not be for him. He doesn't represent my values, nor the values of the majority of the Jewish community.
Stephen, if you don't mind, I think you asked Donna, and by implication Bruce, a somewhat incorrect version of the question. I think what's much more important than it's not a question of whether Jews should be in the Democratic Party or whether a plurality of Jews should be in the Republican Party. The answer is yes to both. The answer is how should Jews be in the Democratic Party and how should Jews be in the Republican Party? The first step is standing up against the Ilhan Omars on one side and the Stephen Kings on the other, the AOCs on one side and the Bannons on the other. That's the first and the easiest step. Where it gets much more complicated, and I won't presume to speak for Donna or her party because she's very talented at it, and I'll be eager to hear more on this. But I think what she touched on is the real challenge for the Democrats, and we can come to the Republican challenge in a moment if you choose, is not just the base of the Democratic Party, but those communities with whom Jews have had the strongest relationships for most of modern history have now become significant challenges to us. Progressive voters, voters in minority communities, young voters of all ethnic heritages. These are the people who Jews, Democrats, or Republicans have stood with and taken great justifiable pride in standing with. And these communities have become challenges to us. And the difficulty, it seems to me, is we, as a people, we see ourselves as David. We're the underdog. We have spent millennia, we have spent thousands of years earning the status as the underdog. But for many progressives, for many minorities, for many young people, we're not David, we're Goliath. And what's even more troublesome in this context than being Goliath is that we still think we're David. We've earned it. We've been David for 5,000 years. I have my sling in my car. I am ready. But figuratively, don't worry. But if I were to show up at my students' parties, one of my students' parties on Saturday night, that would be awkward. I wouldn't drink too much, I wouldn't behave inappropriately, but everybody would be uncomfortable if I was there. It's the same thing if David shows up at Goliath's party and pretends to be David. They don't know what to do with us. And so what I heard from Donna was the beginning, and I'll be eager to hear more from her as the discussion goes on, is not whether Jews should be Democrats, but whether for those Jews who choose to be Democrats, how they should be Democrats, and how they should clear up those misunderstandings with all those voters who once stood with us and who somehow or other have got it in their head that both American Jews and Israel are the oppressors, not the underdogs. I have a close friend who works at AIPAC, and I can make her absolutely crazy by using one 4-word phrase. Those plucky little Palestinians. But if you are a progressive voter of any demographic, and you look at the geopolitics of the Middle East, you're much more likely to see, tragically, Israel as the oppressor. And again, I'll be eager to hear Donna on this more, and just as I want to hear Bruce and Saba more on their respective topics. But it seems to me that the best way to be a Jewish Democrat is to recognize what has happened to those relationships and how and what we can do in order to repair them.
Steve, some of the work that I do, so I have 2 jobs basically, as a scholar, and then I also work at the American Jewish Committee, which is a nonpartisan Jewish human rights organization. And this is exactly what we are working on both the left and the right. And there's no doubt, as a professor for the past 17 years, I have lost jobs because I am a defender of the state of Israel. And when you are a visiting professor, you don't have job security, so you get absolutely bullied by tenured professors because of that. But I think it's also important to recognize that while BDS is dangerous, it's not as someone on the college campus, it's not as significant as people assume it is. It is on the rise, but it's not something. And when we're talking about the squad, we still need to remember they are not the face of the Democratic Party. And a great example of that is that the U.S. House of Representatives overwhelmingly rejected Resolution 246, which rejected BDS. And that was rejected. Basically, it passed 398 to 17. 398 to 17. What is that showing you? Showing you that Israel is not a partisan situation, that you had 350 representatives that supported it. So
For now.
We need to look at it within the context of really what it is, and I think a lot of people get scared, understandably. We're sending our children, our grandchildren off to college, and you think it's this situation, and yes, it went from the colleges now into the House of Representatives, but remember, these four women are not the face of the Democratic Party. We need to look at it within the context of what's really going on.
We're not saying they're the face of the Democratic Party. We're saying they're anti-Semites. Not all four of them, but certainly Tlaib and Omar, and AOC keeps on endorsing everything they say, and if anybody endorses whatever they say and their anti-Semitic comments, one has to be an anti-Semite. So the difference is we have come out and stated that. What I'm going to refer to a comment, you might be familiar with the fact that a new book has come out on anti-Semitism. I will say you're probably much better off on reading Dennis Prager's book on anti-Semitism. But Barry Weiss, who is a writer at the New York Times, came out with a book on anti-Semitism. This is what she wrote on the issue of these two. Calling out politicians like Steve King is easy. Calling out Ilhan Omar is not. That is because Omar is herself targeted by racists and lunatics who wish her harm because of her faith, her gender, or the color of her skin. What does that have to do with her being an anti-Semite? Does nothing. There is not a Democratic politician who has called these two people out as anti-Semites. That's what they are. They should put them in a corner like we have done with Steve King. I personally am waiting to determine who is going to be his primary challenger so that we can make a donation to that campaign. Every Republican I know wants to get rid of this guy. We have called the guy out, and he, as far as we are concerned, he's gone. But he's not really doing anything right now. He's sitting in his office doing whatever he's doing. He's not really a functioning member of the Republican Party. Not one person in the Democratic Party or the Democratic establishment or any organization, including the American Jewish Committee, has called these people out.
No, we have called these women out.
Well, I've read everything you wrote.
But we're nonpartisan,
I have it
so
here,
we
dear.
do it in a way that does not bring in Islamophobic, misogynistic tropes while we're criticizing.
Okay, it's not calling them out to get out of. They should be by the Democratic establishment called out, put in a box, and said, we are going to fight these people from being in our party for the next election in 2020 and make sure that they're not elected again. That is a whole different thing. Now, you also brought up, let me go back to another comment you brought up, which was very insightful, your experience. And Barry Weiss makes another comment in her book. In order to be welcome as a Jew in growing number of progressive groups, you have to disavow a list of things growing longer every day. Whereas once it was enough to criticize Israeli government policy, specifically its treatment of Palestinians, now Israelis' very existence must be denounced. Whereas once it was enough to forswear the Jewish Defense League, now it's the very idea of Jewish power must be abjured. I've never seen that word before. Whereas once Jewish success had to be explained, now it has to be apologized for. Whereas once only Israeli government was demonized, now the Jewish movement for self-determination itself is objected to. So that is what's going on the left. That isn't going on in our operation. That isn't going on in the right. Now, some would like to blame Donald Trump and for the white supremacists and say that they are listening to his tropes and listening to his dog whistles. I don't know any Republican, including Donald Trump, who doesn't think these people are nutcases. That's what they are. They are
really fine people.
That is absolutely wrong. Okay, you want to get into
That's
that?
what he said.
He never said that. Okay, he. All right. First of all,
Can I just throw one thing? Two things that you were just talking about. One is, as quoted in the Michelle Goldberg column in the New York Times, a young woman who's now formed a organization against nationalism said, only one political party is quite literally inciting white nationalists to shoot up our synagogues, drive cars into our peaceful protests, mail bombs to members of our community, burn black churches and mosques, and open fire on Latinx people. The second thing I wanted to just say is, just to what, we were hearing from Rebecca, is that this is a prominent, I don't know if it's prominent or not, I won't say the name because I don't want to give it any exposure, but it's an Orthodox, very right-wing foundation that exists in the Valley. And they send out, to me, absolutely unbearable emails. But you're talking about BDS. Well, here's what they say. There's no Trump problem here. There's Nazism viewed Jews as a race to be eradicated. Today, the current new anti-Semitism, fueled by BDS, is disguised as hatred towards Jews, the only Jewish state in the world. It goes on and on and on, as if the fact that I have a young child, right? Well, not so young, 16-year-old child, and the tenor of conversation that goes on, and it's not all Trump's fault, but it's a huge part of it, the coarseness of his discussions every single day, the relationship he has with tweeting, all of that is impacted by what Donald Trump has done. And the fact is, this Republican Jewish notion of BDS being literally 1938 is dangerous, is not supported, and I will tell you something else. The way we handle this can either make it better or worse. And I would argue that so far it's making it not better. Last thing I'll say, I was on the County Human Relations Commission for 20 years. So I have gone through many, many intergroup battles. I was on with, Melina Abdullah from Black Lives Matter. And most importantly, I worked for Tom Bradley during the Farrakhan incident. And I learned that there's a way to get what you want and there's a way not to. The Jews have not always been the best at getting it the way that is not only morally correct, but is most likely to get the desired result. And I think that that's something that we need to understand and that you were referring to, that you have to know what to do and how to do it given your result. And the other thing, and I can't stress this enough, again, watching the history of the Jews, I know why we're a neurotic, tortured people. I mean, we've had a hell of a history. I mean, really a hell of a history. But I will tell you that other groups, not only do they are not mandated to understand in every, nook and cranny our pain. Do we understand the Middle Passage and the basically, irreversible damage that has caused to, what are now African Americans? I mean, you have to try as hard as you can to walk into someone else's shoes. But we have to understand that as Jews, people, of course, are going to look at us like Goliath. If you look at, the 12 out of the 20 richest people in Los Angeles are Jews. The city council has gone between 5 and 8 members, up to almost half as Jews. Almost all the citywide elected officials are Jews. It is very hard when you are a currently struggling minority that is taking great challenges to look at us and see a David. Now, that doesn't mean they don't have to understand us, but I will tell you, it has to be back and forth.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but that's a really important point, Donna. But that's our obligation. There isn't nearly as much incentive as I would hope there would be in these disaffected communities to make the effort to better understand not just our history, but our current challenges. So it's on us. We as a community do an excellent job of helping other communities understand our problems. We take community and political leaders to Israel. We show them the security threat the country is under. We do that phenomenally well. We don't do quite as good a job of taking the time and effort to understand their challenges. And I would say, I have found, as I think you guys would, most of you would probably agree with me, partisan differences notwithstanding, I think you would agree now with something I believed at the beginning of this panel, that Bruce and Donna are two of the smartest and most principled people I know. And I think, but what I would ask them both is, in addition to the obvious cathartic exercise of calling out the other side, ultimately, in an environment that is so partisan and so polarized as this one, the practicality of Bruce doing anything to remedy our challenges on the left, the likelihood of Donna doing much to remedy, to fix our challenges on the right, are not going to happen if the most principled and impressive Jewish leaders and both parties can look at and stand up to the extremes in their own parties. Then we begin to move forward. And why is that so important? As smart as Donna is, as smart as Bruce is, I will tell you, Saba Soomekh is one of the smartest people I ever met. I worked for the AJC for, unfortunately, a very short period of time. But even over those several months, by far, the smartest thing when I did that job was hire this young woman to work for the organization. And they are lucky to have her. And I left proud, knowing that I had left it as a better organization than I had arrived at because of her presence and her work. You probably hear a butt coming. I'm more concerned about the BDS threat on college campuses than you are, I think, Saba. Here at SC, we've been very fortunate in the past to have administration leaders up to the highest level who've been willing to stand up against the haters. And in the last year or two, as I think Steve and Lisa could tell you, we've begun to see that resurgence. President Sample, the late Beth Garrett, plenty of others stood up against that kind of hatred and allowed our campus, with the work of our amazing students, to face that threat to a less significant degree than has been the case on too many other college campuses. As the faculty advisor to Trojans for Israel, I tell you, I worry that as that vigilance has lapsed to some degree, the threat has begun to reemerge.
Does Israeli policy have any real role to play in the growth of the... I ask that honestly.
Okay, let's put aside Israel for a second. What I will talk about is 18 and 19 and 20-year-olds who face hatred, who face anger, who face vitriol, and who often face violence at Berkeley, at Santa Cruz, at Riverside, at UCI, in Westwood, because we are leaving them on the front lines to face this hatred. And so I understand that the BDS movement has not taken over Congress. I will note that 6 of the 7 Democratic senators who were running for president at the time voted against the anti-BDS legislation in that body. And I say that not as a Republican nor as a Trump supporter, just as an observer. I don't think that Omar and Tlaib and AOC have taken over the Democratic Party, but I do think those attitudes are spreading from the grassroots up. I see a lot of friends in the audience. If any of you have attended the last few California Democratic Party conventions, you understand the scope of that challenge. And before Donna shoots me, I will say, if you have gone to any of the last few California Republican Party conventions, you'll see equally significant challenges. But the reason I bring this up, Donna, is not because of Israel, as important as that is, but because our kids and their friends face this on college campuses every day. And unless we're willing to stand up and face down the haters, both in your party and in Bruce's, we're going to continue to put those young people at risk.
And I'm not undermining the significance of BDS. What I'm saying is it's not, I think when you're outside of a university setting and you're reading certain articles, you think it's everywhere and it's, people are just waiting for Jewish kids with a kippah to pound on them. And what I'm saying is we just need to be very practical with it. I do think it's serious. We think it's so serious that my organization, American Jewish Committee, we actually have a program called Leaders for Tomorrow, where we, for free, bring in high school students where they come with us for 3 hours once a month, where we teach them about Israel advocacy and Jewish advocacy. And we do it in the way where it's not about politics, but it's about policy. So you do it the AJC way, which for us means exactly as Dan was saying. You go to the Latino community, you go to the African American community and say, what is going on with your community? What can we do to help you? And let us tell you what's going on with our community. And in the process, teaching them about the 850,000 Middle Eastern Jews who got kicked out of the Middle East and how they too are refugees and they too are brown when they fit into this, paradigm of brown, black, Jews are white, occupiers, and everyone else is brown or black, etc. So I do think it's a big deal. Our organization thinks it's a big deal, and it's really about empowering your children, your grandchildren, in order to understand how to go on a campus and teach about Israel and how to be empowered to have an intelligent conversation and also learn about anti-Semitism in this country and anti-Semitism all over the world. What I was saying, though, is that it is not, I come from UCLA. It is not, and UCLA has its problems, but I want to take it away from this idea that you walk on a campus as a Jewish student and you're constantly feeling threatened.
I don't know what, I've had a different set of experiences. And a lot of what we're saying, I can't even tell you how this would be heard by other ears. I cannot even tell you what it's like. And I would argue that, I'll tell you 3 facts. One, part of the reason that Israel got in trouble, because our relationship with the CBC, which was always incredibly close, started to sour because, in fact, we were not supporting, and this was true with the Latino community, we were not giving equal weight to what their priorities were to what we expected them to have our priorities. We kept a lot of these elected officials along way longer than they felt comfortable, because you have to understand, again, back to David and Goliath, their community's perception is that we are not a struggling minority that has no power. Even the country that we love so much, Israel, again, from another point of view, is the second, third best, equipped army in the world. I am sorry, if you were, from whether you're from an African nation or a poor neighborhood, you do not see the threat. And I can't, again, I have been on the Human Relations Commission. I have listened to this. I started the New Leaders Project, which if none of you have heard of, is now a 25-year-old exceedingly successful program training young Jewish leaders about the civic community and about how to talk to other groups, and most importantly, how to listen, which I will tell you on the record is not our best quality. And I will say that personally, it is not even my best quality. This is so complex, and we have to stop insisting that they understand our pain until we demonstrate that we understand theirs. And everyone has their, my mother would say, everybody has their peckle on their back. And we are in an advantaged position by all measures of most minorities. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't understand our own history and what we need to do. And I would argue, from here to tomorrow about the things that I believe Donald Trump has done to weaken Jewish life. He's taking away our allies. He's undermining the historic democratic support of the state of Israel and making it a wedge issue when it did not have to be. It has put Nancy Pelosi in an extraordinarily awkward position, and if I have one criticism of the Squad of Four, it's that they are not, at the feet of Nancy Pelosi every single day for these freshmen to think that they will ever combined in their lives accomplish and have the skill set of Nancy Pelosi. So that's my biggest problem. But I'm telling you, we are not there in terms of listening. We are not there. So I'm just going to do this anyway, because what the hell, I have the mic. The 2 things about the eve of the first Martin Luther King Day, which was a huge deal for the Black community. And it was very important that organizations respond and help them to make it a day that was celebrated. Otherwise, it'll turn into Cesar Chavez Day, which is, again, not widely celebrated. So at the very last minute, we asked, what is the Federation doing for Martin Luther King Day? And the answer was, we're doing an assembly at lunch. Okay. So Mark Ridley Thomas, who then was the head of one of the civil rights organizations, called the director at the time and said, look, if you don't close your darn building tomorrow, we're going to picket in front of it. Okay? So what's the problem there? Was there no one in the offices there that could understand how important, it was for them, for the, central address of the Jewish community to close on that day? It's obscene that we didn't realize that, but that weighs on the other side. So I just want to say, and I have more examples, I think that I'll stand up to the fact that I think we don't do the kind of job that will get us the kind of response we want until we do it even better.
It's very hard to control this panel.
I wanted strong people.
I actually only asked 2 questions, and we've been going 40 minutes. But I want the audience to now have some time to also provide in written form questions to the panel. So you can begin to write out your questions, and if you have something you would like to offer. There will be students coming around who will be offering their cards and pens to be able to provide input. While we are waiting on the participation of our audience, I'm reminded that with Bruce, the issue of dual loyalty, which Donna raised earlier, creates its own powerful story of how Jews react and respond to the question of facing this charge. How do you see, and how would you explain the position of Donald Trump when he proposed the issues as he did with regard to questioning Jewish loyalty?
Well, first of all, I've read about this extensively because of my writing and made sure that I knew what I was talking about. And the vast majority of people who pontificated on it in a manner they weren't knowledgeable. First of all, the question was about the fact that Omar and Tlaib were going to present a piece of legislation to defund Israel. He was asked about that. He said, how ignorant can the Jews be to support the Democratic Party, and why are they not loyal? And obviously, why would they not be loyal to Israel? It had nothing to do with America. And I actually encountered The Hill. I don't know how many of you read The Hill. The Hill wrote about how, and I have this in a column of mine, how Donald Trump was asking about loyalty for himself. I said, he's never done that. In fact, in The Hill, I sent the lady I went back and forth with from The Hill, I showed her that her own publication said exactly what I said. This is my answer. In regards to the issue of dual loyalty, my answer is simple. I wrote this. Damn straight I have dual loyalty to Israel. You're absolutely no question I have dual loyalty to Israel. What are we thinking? This is not a question today, at least in the group of people in the Republican Party. They would expect us to have dual loyalty to Israel. I know a lot of Italians who are here. They love America just like I love America, but they have a dual loyalty to Italy. And when I wrote that in an article, I got a response from the Gentiles. Yes, we're with you. We get on that plane just like anybody else. It's not a canard. That is something that is of the past. American people who support Israel support the issue that they would expect that we would support Israel right after we support the United States of America.
Other groups have not had a genocide because of this accusation.
Other groups, I agree, but that was...
It's a really, really dangerous thing to accuse.
I'm sorry, you're wrong.
Also, it's not about Israel. The dual loyalty charge has nothing to do with Israel. Israel's only been around, however many years. The dual loyalty goes back to the beginning of time of the Jewish people, because the loyalty was always more to each other than to the state we were in, for the obvious reason that, and then they would, we couldn't.
That's not what the question was about. No, the question that was directed to Mr. Trump was about, and he answered about loyalty to Israel. Why would Jews not have loyalty to Israel, just like they have that? No one who knows me would ever question my loyalty to the United States of America. There's no more committed American walking the face of this country than Bruce Bialosky. But I absolutely have a dual loyalty to Israel. And if something happened to Israel, I'd be on a plane, even though I'm almost 66 years old. I can't hear very well. I need glasses, but I'd be on a plane defending Israel, because that is the homeland of the Jewish people.
Okay. So we now have tons of questions. So to the panel, in order to get through at least a reasonable number of the 20 questions that we already have, We will ask you to be as brief as possible in offering your responses. Yeah, we will do a couple at a time. So this is, this I said is apparently to Dan. Bernie Sanders has just nominated Linda Sarsour, an openly anti-Zionist, anti-Israel extreme leftist, as his campaign surrogate. If Bernie is the Democratic nominee, do you believe that 2020 will see an exit of American Jewish voters?
I would argue that if Sanders is the Democratic nominee for president, you will see large numbers of Americans of every religious faith and ethnicity opting for an alternative or simply sitting home. Certainly, it's a particular challenge for the Jewish community, but I'll go back to the point I made earlier. It's on the obligation of the most prominent Democrats in our community to call out Sanders for bringing Sarsour into his campaign, just as it's the obligation of the most prominent Jews in the Republican Party to call out the excesses on that side. The fact that Sanders thinks that he can do that, I think, is evidence for the point we were discussing earlier. Not the face of the Democratic Party, not the majority of the Democratic Party, but the increasing challenge we face in traditional progressive communities. But a Sanders-Trump general election, I suspect, Stephen, gives rise to a more credible third-party candidate than we've seen in this country in many, many years for reasons having nothing to do with Linda Sarsour.
I agree.
We have a question for Bruce. I may not be able to read the handwriting on this.
I'll just answer yes.
I'm sorry, it's written with such small, beautiful handwriting, but very tight. So I'm going to have to give it to Bruce to let him try to figure it out. While he's trying to figure it out, we'll ask one more to Donna. Donna, can you say that policy? This again is hard to read. Can you say that policy that you disagree with by the squad and Bernie are reasons to be concerned about what's happening to the Democratic Party?
Compared to my concern about the country, it doesn't even compare.
Go ahead, Bruce.
The essence of this question is,
when did you get so good looking? When did that happen? That's the question, right?
How did you know, Dan?
Lucky guess. I was reading over your shoulder.
Is about the deficit spending in the United States. And the fact that the current president has done nothing about it, even though Republicans are supposed to be deficit hawks. It's a legitimate argument. It's a legitimate thing that the Republicans have not done anything about cutting the deficit. Trump was absolutely focused on funding the defense, which had been cut severely during the Obama period and had left us with inadequate defense. But we as Americans, I've written about this for a long time. I'm a CPA who writes financial articles sometimes, and I actually understand this stuff. And the people in this room have to face up the fact that and we're the ones who stopped this from happening. We're not doing anything about the deficit, and it's coming from two aspects. It's coming from medical aspects, Medicare and Social Security, and we're unwilling to take the hit that we need to take. The fact that they moved up the age limit to it's now at 66 for getting Social Security. They haven't changed the age for Medicare, but they moved it up to 66, while the average age of Americans' lifespan raised 8 years is just a lunacy. We all need to deal with this. Both parties need to deal with this, and Donald Trump hasn't dealt with it, and nobody in Congress wants to deal with it. They just gloss it over. And I will take responsibility as a Republican who vote for these people, and that our side is not doing the job that we should be doing in regards to that.
We have a question for Saba. How does the LA Persian Jewish community perceive the Trump impact?
It's a great question. Like every community, it's not a monolithic community, so I can't sit up here and speak on behalf of the Iranian Jewish community. I could tell you anecdotally from what I see, and again, I haven't taken any samples or anything like that. The Iranian Jewish community depends on who you speak to and what synagogue they go to. The Iranian Jewish community tends to traditionally be more conservative because they are a community that has, although it wasn't just yesterday. If you talk to our grandparents and parents, it feels like it was just yesterday, escaped the Islamic Revolution and dealt with anti-Semitism. So it's still a community where it's not in vogue to criticize Israel. You just support Israel no matter what happens, whomever is the prime minister, et cetera. But there's a different generation that's growing up. It depends on where they go to synagogue. If they are an Iranian Jew who goes to Ikar, they have a very different understanding than if they're an Iranian Jew who goes to another synagogue, to Nesach or something like that. So it just depends, but yes, traditionally, it does tend to be more conservative. Look, I'll tell you, a lot of Iranian Jewish students, if they come from more traditional families, are not allowed to go away to college. They're not really allowed to go backpacking through Europe, wherever, when they are in college. But what they are allowed to do is go to Israel. They are very supportive of AIPAC, and that's not saying that they're to the left or to the right, but Zionism is a huge thing. And people know that, and that's why every single person who's going to run for office, when they come to Los Angeles, they make sure they go to 30 years after, and they make sure that what they talk about is Israel.
Just a fact, the precincts of Beverly Hills were the highest voting Trump precincts in LA County. And as someone who grew up in Beverly Hills when that was not the case, that stands out and that's unique. So I know that I happen to know people on both sides, but
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And I my first book was on Iranian Jews, and I interviewed Jimmy Delshad, who was the first Iranian Jewish mayor of Beverly Hills, and he said to me, "Look," and again I'm paraphrasing, "if I would have a party to try to raise money for the Beverly Hills Fire Department." Now, granted, this was about a decade ago when I did this interview with him. For the Beverly Hills Fire Department, barely any Iranian Jews would show up. If I would have a party to raise money for the Jerusalem Fire Department or the Tel Aviv Fire Department, I could guarantee you 90% of the people who are going to buy those tickets are going to be Iranian Jews.
I just want to also not concede that being pro-Israel means that you are supportive of Trump.
Exactly, that's true. That's true. But I could tell you that there are a lot of arguments at Shabbat tables. A lot of arguments between generations.
Okay, we're going to move very fast now because we have 10,000 Christians here. So Dan, I'm going to put you on the spot. One of our audience members has said, how should we respond to the fact that 80% of the people in this room today are people over 50 years of age? Where are our young people?
I'd say that there's two big challenges on that front. One, just doing programs on a weekend rather than a weekday is going to cut into college age attendance, regardless of the topic. But the second challenge is a really, really important one. And it goes back to a point that I was making earlier about change in attitudes toward Israel in particular, but toward the Jewish community in particular. I mentioned earlier that I'm the faculty advisor here to Trojans for Israel, which is the best part of my work here. And what I've found is that more and more the students who join an organization like ours are exceptions, not the rule. And there's a sometimes funny, sometimes painful line from Jon Stewart. Jon Stewart says, "I'm not that religious, I'm just short of Jew-ish." And I think particularly among younger generations, given the David and Goliath dynamic that I was talking about earlier, don't stand up against Israel the way members of the other communities I referenced did. But they're much less energized and often very diffident on questions, not only this when it comes to Middle Eastern geopolitics, but when it comes to involvement in the Jewish community. Any number of organizations, Federation, AJC, ADL, work very hard at youth outreach. But it's a challenge, and it's because young progressives and not just in the Jewish community, but more broadly, young people, the millennial and post-millennial generation lean heavily left in America today. If you're a progressive, you root for the underdog. You root for David. And convincing not just minority communities, not just progressives in other communities, not just young people in other communities, but convincing the young people in our own community that we are not the oppressor is what it's going to take to not only fill this room, but fill it with a much broader generational presence. And on that front as well, we have a long way to go.
So each of the panelists has now been given some questions which will keep them occupied for a few minutes as they read the questions, and they're going to try to sort together their comments, trying to frame responses to several questions at once. It's not that they need to necessarily read out the questions, but rather to pull from the questions the core issues that are being asked. So we're each giving them a few seconds to catch up, because the final exam, they'll have to be ready for all of this. Saba is ready.
Okay, so my question is basically BDS. How do I downplay it? Aren't I doing a disservice by downplaying it? People who are BDS supporters will then grow up to be voters, etc. I'm not downplaying it, but what I am saying is, as someone who has been on a college campus for 16 years, it is important to listen to the students and the professors and the Hillel directors who are telling you, yes, it is a problem, but please let's be realistic about it, as opposed to a lot of people or a lot of different organizations who will say, it's the biggest deal in the world, give us your money because this is what's going on. What I want to make sure that people don't think of is that a college student is going to go on a campus and they're going to be beaten up, or they're, it's just this hostile environment. It could be. And as I said, my own personal experience, I have lost a job because of this at a university because of pro-BDS professors. But I'm just trying to be realistic about it. Instead of just focusing on BDS, let's focus on educating our kids, right? Our Jewish kids on Israel, on Israeli history, and how to be active supporters of the country and active supporters and global citizens of this country.
I revere Saba Soomekh, but I just don't agree.
Okay.
Can I?
No, we're going to Bruce next, and then we'll come to you.
Do you understand that Barack Obama was president of the United States and Israel is focus of interest of the United States, yet still provided significant funding for Israel, not just Palestinian people? So will you acknowledge that your comments were ad hominem comments about Obama were unfair? First of all, they were not ad hominem, they were factual. Second of all, for 8 years, President Obama was my president. I never referred to him as anything other than President Obama or Mr. Obama. He had other responsibility. He's the President of the United States. There's absolutely no question. That's his priority. But his secondary priority, as in charge of foreign affairs for this country, is to deal with our friends. I would be arguing the same thing for Great Britain, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Mexico, if I were from those countries, that he should be respectful and helpful for them because they're our allies. And if somebody thought I was making ad hominem comments about him as this person's, I apologize, but they were not anything but factual. President Obama was all of our presidents. I just think it was a policy issue on which he did things that I disagreed.
Dan?
Most of my questions had to do with how to talk about Israel. And once again, given the spirit of hyperpartisanship in the society in which we live, I'll give two answers to that question rather than one, because I really do believe the challenges are very different for our allies in both of the major parties. In the Democratic Party, I think in talking to the more progressive voters who I was referring to earlier, I like to cite a quote by Mark Twain, who said, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes." And when I am talking to members of other communities, particularly younger members of other communities, I try to keep in mind the point that Donna was making earlier. When they look at us, they see Goliath. And so it's important to provide them a little bit of historical perspective. And while our ongoing challenges are not identical to theirs, the point I try to make is that there's lessons to be learned. So I will tell someone who worries about a family member being deported from the US, I'll tell them about family members of mine that weren't allowed in this country by President Roosevelt. The difference then is, instead of using the term terrorists, the term was spies. And instead of worrying about those who would cause destruction on behalf of Middle Eastern countries, the concern is that my family members would spy on behalf of either the Nazis or the communists. So it's not the same challenge. It's not identical. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And to the greatest extent, we can say our challenges aren't all that different than yours. I want to learn more about yours so that I can help you overcome them, as opposed to come to Israel and learn about ours. So, one of the things, one of the classes I've taught here over the years is a course called Case Studies in Modern Leadership. And I tell the students that, oddly enough, one of the most important qualities of a good leader is listening. And again, I think a good lesson for our community, while we take justifiable pride in the work we did with the Freedom Riders a half a century ago, it's time to listen and make it clear to the leaders and the members of these communities that we're there for them, just like so we have a leg to stand on when we ask them to be there for us. For the Republicans, obviously the challenge is a little bit different for reasons we've all alluded to, albeit in somewhat different ways. Republican leaders don't have to convince their supporters about the importance of Israel. That's the Republican stake in the Jewish community. I would suggest, and Bruce, to his credit, alluded to it a little bit earlier too, that the challenge for Republicans in our community and more broadly is recognizing that it's not only about Israel. And there is considerable public opinion polling that shows that as of the early part of the 21st century, the majority of American Jews have moved decisively to identify domestic policy issues, particularly those social and cultural issues, as being of primary import, rather over issues relating to the safety and security of Israel and geopolitics of the Middle East. And so just while I'd respectfully encourage my Democratic friends to listen to the challenges from other communities and then share ours, I'd with equal respect encourage my Republican friends, rather than bewailing the fact that not enough Jews vote on Israel, to recognize that and broaden the discussion to hopefully increase outreach into our community on those domestic policy issues as well. I tell my students that Lyndon Johnson once said, "The second most important thing in any conversation is what I want." Now, there's two things wrong with that statement. One, it's not true. The most important thing in any conversation is what I want. Whether it's greater safety and security for Israel, whether it's more school choice or increased healthcare or improved public safety, or to go for Chinese food rather than Indian after the panel tonight. But as I think all of you are smart enough to know, I'm much more likely to get what I want if I listen to what's important to the people who I'm with and can fashion my outreach to them based on not just what's most important to me, but what's most important to them. Second thing wrong with that quote, of course, is that LBJ never said it. I made it up. But what I learned years ago is in the classroom, if you attribute a quote to a famous person, the students think they're going to get asked about it on a midterm or a final, so they write it down. So that's a bad habit, and I apologize for it.
Donna?
Well, I have quite an array here. Two things about why I think and said that Trump is an existential crisis. A couple of things. First of all, as I mentioned, in terms of our domestic life in America, I think that, again, the bringing up the dual loyalty, which I will remind, is not a concept that came up with Israel. This is why we got kicked out of Spain. This is why we got the Babylonian exile. I mean, this has been a long-standing problem. So the fact that he brings it up, I think, is a problem for us. And I do, again, I do have a little, my father was the happiest, sunniest person, born in Boyle Heights, ended up in the other BH, and my mother had a different experience, having been a survivor from the Holocaust. So I get the fear, but I do think bringing up our Achilles heel is dangerous. And I think this is a dangerous path that we can potentially be on. That is something to watch. And not so much if you live in Los Angeles. We have, 4, 5, 600,000 people. But for Jews that do not live in the major urban centers, I think it makes it more dangerous. I think the fact that he's making it a wedge issue in Congress is absolutely an existential threat for Israel, not perhaps in its survival, but its relationship with the United States and our money. Because the bulk of Jews are players in the Democratic Party. An unseen amount of Democratic money is raised from the Jewish community, and that counts Jewy Jews and Hollywood Jews. I mean, it's anywhere between 40 and 60% it has been. If you start, that's where our power is. And, you can wish, and the Republicans can wish that somehow there's going to be a sea change and all the rich Jews are going to become Republicans. But I'm willing to stake, my reputation on the fact that's not going to happen. So if you start making it not something that the Jews are talking about as much, that they're not putting forward, that the community is, doesn't want to get smashed by, the pro-Israel PACs that are called pro-Israel PACs that are the ones that AIPAC kind of, gives information to. They really are a fraction of Jewish money in politics. So to ignore that a huge part of our leverage comes from Democrats, and to start making every Democrat have to have a litmus test because they're a Democrat, I think is crazy. And I will tell you that the majority of American Jews will pick America. I'd like to, it's not like Democrats don't care about Israel. If you look at, Henry Waxman, Howard Berman, these people are Democrats. And that's still our home, and it's still where we have power. So to think that it's good for Israel to shift the power to a minority of Jews with a minority of money and a minority of involvement is, to me, ridiculous. And I think that's a dangerous path. I think the pulling out of the Iran deal was dangerous for Israel. Now, of course, there's going to be other Jews who say the opposite. But again, the majority of American Jewries and the majority of American elected officials believe that deal was important. And I will tell you, I personally feel less safe now, having been, extracted from that deal than I did, when it was made. And I think that that's critical. So that's, those are some of the, it goes on and on, just include, tearing our families apart. Actually speaking of Howard Berman, Janice Berman said to me this morning, it's torn her family apart, and I'm sure everybody has an example of that. Certainly, not just Jews, all of Americans have really been torn apart by this support. One other thing that someone asked was, report of what specific Trump has done vis-a-vis the Iranians. All right, so the Iranian deal. Where I disagree with, how did we miss, there's a question saying, how did we not know to close our doors on the first MLK Day? Well, if you know anyone between 25 and 40, there's something called the New Leaders Project, and put them through it, and they'll find out how we could possibly not have known. I'll tell you one other quick story, which is during this Farrakhan crisis, which was in 1985, and the Jewish community wanted Bradley to condemn Farrakhan before he spoke. And it became an enormous, huge, people were picketing my seats at Rosh Hashanah. I mean, it was a huge deal because I worked for Tom Bradley, and I was getting screamed at nonstop. But that's where I really learned the lesson of having that muscle that you have to stretch to understand how other people see it. Because to the African American community, Farrakhan at the time had a powerful message, which out of 3 hours, 10 minutes was anti-Semitism. The rest of you remember he was very hard on the African-American community and saying it's your responsibility to step up. We have to take care of ourselves. We have to make sure our young boys are good fathers, etc. So there was a famous meeting of a Jewish organization where the religious leaders and other community organization leaders were invited, as were Jewish community leaders. And the head of one of our groups devoted to intergroup relations got up, and if you remember, Bradley lost the first time as governor and was running again. And they said to the assembled masses of African American leaders, they said, look, we as Jews will not support Tom Bradley if he runs for governor a second time unless you do what we say. What do you think the reaction was? Every African American leader politely got up and left. And that, my friends, was the end of the modern Jewish African American dialogue. So when Dan, picked up on the thing about listening, I cannot tell you how critical that is to our future, and how critical it is that we not only listen, that we respond even more than we think we might have to, because we have the advantages. And I will tell you something, Farrakhan, who gave this speech in 1985 and gave the same speech in 1980, as far as I see, until Trump, the American Jewish community did just fine. We survived his appearance. I went to the forum to hear him. He has a standard 10 minutes of anti-Semitism. But for us to stake the entire black-Jewish relationship on demanding something that wasn't even existential for us at all was a huge mistake. And I can give you other examples. So I think that Trump is making a society that's going to be tougher for us, that's going to pit Jews against Jews, that is going to lose the majority of Jewish support for the party that has been there for us. It was Harry Truman that created the State of Israel. And so, and I stick by that.
So we have 12 minutes left, so each panelist will have just a few minutes to deal with the 4,000 questions that are in front of them. Bruce.
Before I answer this question, I just want to say something in regards to what Donna just said. And I've written this. We survived the presidency of Harry Truman. A lot of people back then thought we wouldn't. We survived the presidency of Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, Bush 1, Bush 2, Clinton, Obama, and we will survive the presidency of Trump. This is the United States of America. This is a democracy. There's no stronger democracy than anywhere in the world, and we will be fine. Now, to address
If you don't like clean water, clean air.
To address this question, we'll agree to disagree on that one, Don. Do you think that issues of climate change, healthcare, and ever-expanding debt are important to Americans? All right. I've been doing this a long time, national politics for 40 years. I have stated to the people that you have to pick priorities on what your interests are. My priorities on policies are national defense, taxes, economics, and Israel. Those are my three priorities. You can't focus on 500. But if you want to read my columns, I have probably, in the last 12 years, written well over 600 columns. I doubt if 5 of them are in Israel. In fact, I suggest you read my column I recently wrote, Losing a Doctor is a Loss for Us All. I met with a doctor yesterday. I had lunch with him as a follow-up. All these issues are important to all of us, and I understand that completely, and all of us understand that completely. But in the spectrum of focus, you can only focus as a priority when you go into the poll. What are you going to vote on? Are you going to vote on health care? Are you going to vote on abortion? You're going to vote on Israel, national defense? What issues are most important for you? And that's what I expressed earlier. But yes, these are important to all Americans. And if I gave an impression that they aren't important to me or the Republicans, I apologize for that, because that's absolutely not true.
So Dan, I know you have to catch a flight, so we're going to let you have your say and hit and run.
Phew. I'll be uncharacteristically quick. We're better than this. We're better than this as a Jewish community, and we're better than this as American people. The nastiness, the ugliness, the intolerance is a bipartisan affliction. I see it on both sides, and I see the selective outrage on both sides calling out their opposite numbers for it. Going back to the point I was making a moment ago about how to talk within your respective parties, let's let that be part of the message too. Let's set an example to those frightened younger people in minority communities who really do believe that their stake in the American dream is being denied. Let's reach out to them and remind them, for those of us that we stand with them and we want to help them. But the people who disagree with us are opponents and not enemies. They're not stupid and they're not evil. Odds are they're reasonably principled people who happen to have a different idea about how to resolve the most important public policy challenges that we face as a society. And then similarly, to turn to those equally frightened white working class voters on the other side of the aisle who, just as many on the left, feel like they're being denied their part of the American dream. But all these people who voted for Trump out of fear that their portion of the American dream was going to be taken away from them. And let's remind those frightened people on both sides of the aisle that we can disagree on the specific policy remedies it's going to take to move forward, but this ugliness, this bitterness, this nastiness, this violence is not the way a civilized society behaves. And I believe, and I'm totally prejudiced and totally biased on this front, I don't think there's any better community to set that example for the rest of society than ours. Thanks very much.
I'll be really quick. The questions that were asked towards me were about anti-Semitism. Is it possible to oppose Israeli politics without being labeled anti-Semitic or self-hating Jew? I think opposing Israeli politics makes you a Zionist. If you criticize Israel and you come from it with an intelligent understanding of Israel, and not deny Israel's right to exist, there's no reason. I mean, when we throw out the word anti-Semite to everyone, then no one's really an anti-Semite, right? We're cheapening that word. Let's reserve that word for people who really are anti-Semitic. No one would turn to Bruce and hear his criticism of Obama or Clinton or whomever on the Democratic Party and say, you are anti-American. If anything, they would say you're a patriot because you care about America so much, you're criticizing the government. No one would turn around to Donna and say the same thing. So why do we say it to the Jewish community? Israel is a country, and for a lot of people, Israel is a cause, but at the end of the day, Israel is a country. If we want it to be treated and given the respect of every other country, we need to treat it like a country. Now, what does that mean? I always tell my students, if you want to argue about Israeli politics and Israeli policies, that's absolutely okay, but you cannot argue that Israel does not have a right to exist. That's when it becomes anti-Semitic. So when a professor argues about Israeli politics, I don't think that's anti-Semitic. When they throw out false accusations of apartheid and colonization, I think that is anti-Semitic. When they say, I will not write a letter of recommendation for you because you're going to Israel to study abroad, but hey, if you want to go to China, I'll do it, and that you can't even compare the two countries. If they're not going to bring a professor from Israel to come speak at a university, but they have no qualms about bringing professors from countries that do horrific things, that to me is anti-Semitic. And the other question was asked about a lot of BDS supporters are actually rabbis, Jewish scholars, and Jewish activists. Does that make them anti-Semites? And again, I think there's degrees of that. Look, I have a lot of students who support BDS, and when I ask them what that means, honestly, they have no idea. Why? Because a lot of the student groups that support BDS really sanitize the Palestinian narrative. They really, in terms of terrorism, et cetera, and they give this very white and black understanding of it. So they don't understand when they say, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, that means the annihilation of the Jewish state, because they've probably never sat in on a Middle Eastern history course to really understand that. For them, they're these woke leftists, this is what I'm saying because this is what everyone is saying. So I think there's levels. Do I throw out to my students, you're an anti-Semite? When they say that, I say, no, you need to understand how this is anti-Semitic, how the leader of the BDS movement, Barghouti, is an anti-Semite. Now, that's different than professors and scholars who are very well aware of what these sayings mean when they throw this out, or again, when they single out the only Jewish country as opposed to any other country and hold it to a standard that is not applicable.
So the good news for Donna and Bruce is, although we have just a few minutes left, there are 400 days till the next election, so they'll have lots of time to continue their dialogue. Donna, your closing comments?
I'll try to be brief. One thing I just wanted to mention, when if you look at the HBO show Our Boys, and if you haven't watched it, I recommend it. I think it's an extraordinary show, and literally nothing has made me prouder of Israel than watching it, because it shows a depth of understanding, of empathy, compassion, anger, and maturity in the dialogue about what their reality is with Palestinians that is very, very, very hard to achieve here. And it's so easy for them to do it there. And, not only the production qualities and everything else, but the fact that Israel can produce that show and can have that depth and have the confidence to expose their own weaknesses as well as the other side exposing their weaknesses, to me, That makes me proud as a Jew. And lastly, I will just say again, I think Trump is dangerous for the Jews, and I think it'll take a while to correct what he's done. I think he's weakened us in terms of our foreign policy, in example, the Iran deal. I think he's weakened us in terms of Jewish values and where the majority of Jews lie. And thirdly, I think that he's threatening Israel. And I think that that is something that will be it'll be hard to turn around. So I hope, so far the Constitution is, along with the rabbinic era, I think the Constitution was the most brilliant document ever written. And it's getting a test now like none other. You remember what happened with Bush v. Gore? As painful as it was, the Supreme Court said something and we moved on. The question, if this document gets us through this period, this thing should, replace the Magna Carta and everything else ever written in human history in terms of the genius of the flexibility to protect us from this kind of person. And I hope that will include the Jewish community as well.
And for the last word, Bruce.
Donna and I have been arguing about this stuff for 35 years, and we're still civil to each other, and that's what we should always be, and that's the way we've always been. This is about public policy. And as I said before, some people are very upset about Trump. I want to remind the people who are ardent Trump supporters that for 8 years, we just closed our eyes and grinned and bared Barack Obama as our president. But he was our president. And we didn't run around with our hair on fire, and we didn't scream and yell. We argued about the points, and if anybody went further than that near me, I said, hey, this is about public policy. This is about civility. This is the United States of America. We don't do anything other than that. And I appreciate the opportunity to argue those points that was presented to us today by these two doctors. Thank you very much.
We want to, first of all, thank the panelists and their thoughtful and extensive engagement with the issues. And I know some of you are frustrated that the questions that you had were not totally and completely answered, but that's all part of the political discourse. And so you're going to have to be invited back for more of this. Thank you very much.
If I can have your attention just for a minute before you leave, 2 announcements. First, I want to take just a moment to make my own. It's hard to be a professor and shut up the whole 2 hours. We had a conference here, a day-long conference several months ago called Can We Talk About It? Opening up the Israeli-Palestinian dialogue. And I can tell you, as director of the Institute, I got several phone calls and emails, very angry ones, saying do not participate in this panel or in this day, that it's going to be a loaded event. And my feeling was, that's the absolute wrong response. That if we can't talk about the things that divide us, we can never pull together as a world or as a nation. And I would have to say, as I remind my mother, who's a survivor of Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, and Salzwedel, who also believes in Israel, right or wrong, it isn't always wrong. It's Israel right, but when Israel is wrong, we call it out. And as I remind her, the way in which peace happens in this world, if we think the Trump presidency is controversial, let's go to Ireland for a minute. My family and I were in Dublin the day after they signed the peace accord. And on the front page was Gerry Adams and Gerry Adams and the opposite end. I just went brain dead for a second. The Protestant and the Catholic leaders. There was a picture of the two of them with the President of Ireland in the middle, and they asked them to shake hands after they had just signed a peace accord. They refused to shake hands, but they signed the peace accord. And after the peace accord, Ireland has done very well. As I say, one of the driving goals of the Casden Institute is to bring light, not heat. And I want to thank our panelists today for doing, as Bruce said, precisely that, for speaking to one another. Each has their own point of view, but with respect. And hopefully, as Jews, what we want to do is, as we move towards 2020, what brings us together? We can disagree, but what brings us together as Jews who are both Jews and Americans? The two announcements: we would invite you to join us afterwards for a modest reception. And for those of you who need a little extra koyach, we have carts. If you go to the back in the corner there where it says exit, there will be some carts to take you to the parking lot. Thank you so much for coming today, and thank you to our panel.